everyone. Thanks for joining us on this lovely sunny day. Well, I can only speak for Dublin. It's 24 degrees out there. I'm just waiting on a few more people to join. I see the numbers are rapidly rising. I think we had over 400 people who have registered today, so it's wonderful to see that there's so much interest. So I'm just waiting on a few more to join. Okay, I may as well get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dimpna Clerkin, and I am the Training and Information Manager here at the Housing Agency. Thanks so much for joining us on the second session in our new Housing Essentials Learning Series. Before I move on to today's topic, I just wanted to briefly mention our new apprenticeship programme, which some of you heard me speak about during last week's session. Subject to final QQI validation, the Social and Affordable Housing Apprenticeship is due to commence this October. So this is a very important initiative that has been developed in partnership with the sector over the past 4 years, and it will provide an important new pathway into a career in housing. The programme is a 2-year earn and learn apprenticeship for aspiring housing officers, combining practical workplace experience with structured learning. We are currently seeking applications from approved housing bodies and local authorities who are interested in taking on apprentices, and indeed any of you that are watching who would like to get a well-rounded formal education in housing to develop your own career. We're delighted by the level of interest we've received so far from both potential apprentices and employers, and I'm happy to report that there was an upsurge in interest after I mentioned it last week. We have been working very closely with the City of Dublin FET Ballsbridge College, which will be the first centre to host it. So if you'd like to find out more, we will share the link to the Ballsbridge College website in the chat. And if you have any questions or you would like to express an interest, please feel free to contact us at training@housingagency.ie. The apprenticeship programme is just one example of how we implement one of the key objectives of the Housing Agency, which is supporting housing professionals as a community of practice to build capacity across the housing system. We provide a range of professional training and development opportunities designed to support people at every stage of their housing careers. And that brings me nicely to the Housing Essentials series. This is a new 5-part learning series aimed at anyone who is new to the housing sector, as well as those of you who would like a refresher on how housing in Ireland works. Our most recent training needs survey showed that 62% of respondents are relatively new to the sector, reporting less than 5 years' experience. So we developed this series to provide a clear, practical introduction to housing policy, housing systems, and day-to-day practice in Ireland. While we can't cover everything in depth during each session, our aim is to give you a strong foundation and help you understand the key elements of the housing system. We'll also signpost relevant resources and further learning opportunities for anyone who would like to explore particular topics in more detail. So just to quickly run through what's coming up next in the series. After the summer, on the 9th of September, we will be looking at Starter Homes programme. On October 15th, we have Building Inclusive Communities Part 1. That will cover age-friendly housing and housing first. And then we will wrap the series on the 12th of November with Building Inclusive Communities Part 2. And that will focus on housing for disabled people and for traveller communities. You can register for all of these sessions in the link that will be posted in the chat in just a moment. And also you will find a copy of today's presentation and previous presentation materials on our new Housing Agency website. And just a reminder, this session is being recorded and you will find the recording from today's session on our YouTube channel. And last week's session is already up there. So we leave all the questions until the end and we'll stop the recording before the Q&A. And if you have any questions related to today's presentation, put them into the Q&A box as we go along and we will try to answer as many questions as we can at the end. So, without further ado, let me tell you about what we have in store for you today. This session provides a practical overview of how social housing operations work in Ireland. It will explain how housing need is assessed, how homes are allocated, and how supports and schemes are used to assist households. The session will help attendees understand key operational terms and processes, from HAP and RAS to choice-based letting and differential rent, with signposting to where more detailed information can be found. Today's presenter is Patrick McCarthy. Patrick, or Pa, as he's known to most of us, has been head of local authority and AHB services in the housing agency since September 2023, having held numerous roles in the housing agency since joining it in 2015. He has also previously worked in a development role in Circle Voluntary Housing Association. Prior to that, he worked in homelessness services in Dublin and Melbourne, Australia, and he holds a BA and a Master's in Planning and Sustainable Development and postgrad certs in both governance and project management. So it's over to you now, Pat.
Thank you very much, Dimpla, and welcome everyone. And as Dimpla mentioned, we'll cover as much as we can today, but really important for everyone. We'll be looking at things at a surface level, and those of you that want to know more will need to look at guidance, legislation, regulations, etc. Okay, so during today's session, we will look at social housing assessments, focusing on eligibility, housing need, and referring to the evidence used to qualify households. We will look at the options at the disposal of the local authority to support people with their housing. We will also look at the area of allocation of social housing support and how this is designed to work at a local level. We will look at the differential rent system at a high level, and we'll look closely at the housing assistance payment scheme given the volume of households that are availing of HAP. Okay, so we'll now look at social housing assessments, but bear in mind we're looking at it at a high level. We will cover it, but practitioners who wish to know the grainy detail will need to look further into this particular area. Okay, so all households that are seeking social housing support must first be assessed by a local authority. So at a high level, a social housing assessment answers three key questions. Does the household qualify? What is their housing need? Factors here are what size is the household? Are there health concerns or a disabled person in the household? Or are there other circumstances that are a factor in the assessment, and what support route is most appropriate following the assessment? Once it's completed, the household is placed on the housing list and has immediate access to the housing assistance payment, which we'll return to later in the presentation. Allocation of social housing support happens later under the local authority allocation scheme, again which we'll cover shortly in this presentation. Okay, so what does the assessment look at? Income assessment establishes whether the household falls within the relevant threshold. And really important to know, there are a number of different income thresholds depending on the local authority a household is applying to. Residency requirements are assessed, including legal residency, local connection, and alternative accommodation. Test whether the application belongs with the authority and whether there is another suitable housing option available to the household applying for social housing support. Housing need and special circumstances shape how the household is recorded, but importantly may influence their priority later in terms of allocation of social housing. Tenancy history is also relevant and should be considered in line with policy and local procedures. What's relevant here is rent arrears and repayment arrangements that have been entered into and complied with. Okay, so with all of these areas, really important to understand the legislative background to them. So, the 2009 Housing Act provides the core assessment framework, and the 2011 Social Housing Assessment Regulations set out application and eligibility rules. Following on from this, allocation and housing assistance payment are governed by related but separate legal frameworks, which is why qualification and allocation are not the same thing. So in practice, a household first becomes qualified and is recorded on the housing list, and priority and offers come later through local allocation rules. So, in terms of the process, the decision and the outcomes of the assessment, the first key point is a complete application and evidence are essential. Local authorities are bound by a 12-week decision timeframe that's set out in statute, but this does not apply where information is missing or an application is incomplete. So applicants for social housing must ensure that their social housing application form is completed in full and that supporting documentation is provided at the outset and on the request of the local authority. And another key point is that the social housing application form itself is set out in the social housing assessment regulations, and therefore each local authority in the country will have the same or similar social housing application form with some nuances to cater for local arrangements. Once a household is assessed and qualified, the household then joins the record of qualified households, or more commonly known as the housing list. So a really important point is that being on the list itself does not necessarily mean an immediate offer of a home. And offers depend on suitable stock and the allocation scheme. We'll return to the allocation scheme very shortly, but this guides how social housing supports are prioritised and allocated. There are also rules around refusals of accommodation, so participants really do need to understand why offer suitability and communication with the local authority matter. And from the perspective of local authority practitioners, it's really important that your applicants understand the rules around offers, the assessment process, and the allocation scheme itself. So I mentioned at the outset that we will look at all these areas at a surface level, but it's really important. The social housing assessment process is nuanced, it's detailed, and practitioners working in that space need to refer to more detailed operational guidance, circulars, income calculation material, the 2009 Housing Act, and the Social Housing Assessment Regulations, which are the core legal sources. And you should be really familiar with these if you are working in this space. The housing manual the housing agency hosts is a great resource in general, but specific to assessments, there's lots of material there for you to get stuck into. And lastly, assessment and allocation forms are in place. These are made up of housing practitioners working on assessments or allocations. They're coordinated by the housing agency. And for practitioners, they're really useful spaces for clarifying local authority practice, sharing good practice, and enhancing consistency of approach. So, once a household is qualified, the support offered may take different forms depending on need, stock, programme rules, and local availability. So in the next few slides, I'm going to run through the various types of social housing support that local authorities can offer. So, the types of support that a local authority can provide are again set out in Section 19 of the 2009 Housing Act. So, We're not that far into today's presentation, and the 2009 Act has come up on numerous occasions. So a general point for everyone, the 2009 Housing Act is crucial. It was mentioned in session 1. It's also known as the Social Housing Reform Act, so it's very important from a social housing operations perspective. Returning to the topic, more traditional forms of social housing support that are allocated by local authorities include a council tenancy in a local authority home, or an approved housing body tenancy allocated to a person or household from the social housing waiting lists. Local authorities can also offer homes made available for social housing use through leasing arrangements with private property owners or through the rental accommodation scheme. And to briefly explain the rental accommodation scheme, it's similar to HAP in that tenancies are in the private rented sector and based on the terms and conditions of the Residential Tenancies Act. The distinction between rental accommodation scheme and HAP is that the local authority is also a party to the tenancy. I beg your pardon, is a tripartite arrangement where the local authority is significantly more involved than it would be under the housing assistance payment. Some supports respond to the accommodation type required or to a suitable ownership pathway. This would include traveller-specific accommodation, or less commonly, the provision of sites, as well as sale and tenant purchase options where legislation and local policy allows for this. So another form of social housing support is the housing assistance payment. HAP is a private rented support that can be used to meet an approved household's long-term housing need. We will return to HAP later in this session in more detail, but essentially the household sources private rented accommodation and the local authority pays HAP directly to the landlord each month. In return, the household pays an income-based differential rent to the local authority and any additional rent payment due to the landlord where the HAP payment is lower than the rent set for the tenancy. Households seeking to access HAP must qualify for social housing support and must secure a suitable rented home. There are maximum rent limits depending on the household size and locality, and the local authority also has some discretion to pay more than the limits where this is required. A key aspect of HAP is that the local authority is not the landlord, and generally HAP tenancies are governed by the Residential Tenancies Act. HAP is not considered to be an allocation of social housing support. However, households in receipt of HAP are deemed to be in receipt of social housing support and are no longer included on the housing waiting list. In the next section, we will look at the allocation of social housing supports. The allocation of social housing support at its core is about how available supports are prioritised among qualified households. So as we touched on earlier, local authorities can provide, facilitate or manage a range of supports, including local authority dwellings, approved housing body dwellings, and homes or sites that they acquire, build, lease or refurbish. These forms of social housing support are all set out in Section 19 of the 2009 Act. Other listed support forms include rented accommodation arrangements and traveller accommodation. An important point to note is that Section 19 lists what can be provided. Sections 20 and 22 govern qualification for and allocation of social housing support respectively. So the next area we're going to look at is local authority allocation schemes. Allocation schemes essentially translate the housing list into a local order of priority. The statutory basis is Section 22 of the 2009 Housing Act and the 2011 Social Housing Allocation Regulations. and each local authority is required to make an allocation scheme as well as publish it. The making of a scheme is a reserved function, meaning it is a function of the elected members in the local authority. Additionally, the Minister for Housing has the power to make regulations for the matters to be included in an allocation scheme. The scheme must determine who can be considered, how priority is applied, and how different dwelling categories are matched. Local discretion is a feature, and authorities can reserve proportions of dwellings for particular classes of household, tenure types, or even transfer needs. The key policy point is transparency. Scarce homes must be allocated consistently and in line with published rules. And when local authorities are making allocations, they are matching housing need, stock type, and community balance. So, in terms of how priority is usually applied. So schemes vary, but the vast majority combine waiting list time with assessed need and stock suitability. So waiting time on the list matters, but it is not the only factor. Medical needs, disability, homelessness, older persons, or the requirements for traveller-specific accommodation may affect priority. More recently, other groups are to receive priority. For example, people who had experience living in industrial school settings. Stock suitability is equally important. Local authorities are considering the bedroom need of a particular household, the accessibility of the home from an older person's perspective and from the perspective of disability. The dwelling type and the area of choice all shape whether a home is appropriate for a particular household. And it's really important to understand there is no single national queue, and fairness depends on published local schemes and consistent administration. So, apologies. So an important point to remember is that social housing is by no means limited to general needs housing, and there is accommodation that is appropriate for particular groups. For example, traveller-specific accommodation delivered under the local traveller accommodation programme, or housing suitable for disabled people or older people. Housing for disabled and older people often require a different design approach to ensure the home is suitable. And my colleagues Ciara Whelan and Andrew Guy will go into more detail on this particular area in the final Housing Essentials session in November. In terms of process, an offer follows local priority rules, but the local authority still checks suitability prior to allocation. There's a check whether the applicant is on the record of qualified households or a transfer list. The authority reaffirms eligibility, updated need, and the suitability of the dwelling when considering an allocation. Importantly, transfer list households are not reassessed for eligibility. The home then can be allocated directly or after a bid process under the choice-based letting system. CBL allows households to express interest in advertised properties, and a household is selected, again based on the relative priority position of that particular household against the other households that have also expressed an interest in taking up the tenancy. Acceptance of an offer starts the tenancy process, and refusals of offers can also occur. A reasonable offer is normally one that meets housing needs and is in an applicant's area of choice, except in emergency cases. Two refusals of reasonable offers has consequences in that no further offers will be made for a period of 12 months. So a key point here for practitioners is that applicants need to understand why an offer is considered suitable and what refusal consequences may follow. So again, in terms of further resources around the allocation of social housing support, a really useful resource that goes into a lot more detail is the Social Housing Allocation Toolkit, and this is hosted on our housing manual. This includes all resources relating to this area, including circulars, other guidance, income calculation resources. Again, the 2009 Act is key, and the social housing allocation regulations made under this Act for the operational and legal detail are all crucially important. And I'll mention again, forums and national or regional practitioner networks coordinated by the Housing Agency are really useful for practitioners who want to stay aligned on interpretation and implementation. So, moving on to the differential rent system. So rent setting is a core operational part of social housing. It links affordability, tenant obligations, and council and often AHB income. So the next few slides are a practical explanation of how rent follows household means rather than market rent or the cost of providing the housing. So the differential rent system we have in place in Ireland is relatively unique across Europe, where social housing rents are often linked to the cost of delivery and or the provision of the home. It's a model where rent is linked to household income and ability to pay. This means that lower household income means a lower rent, and where household income rises, rent normally rises too. Each local authority sets and publishes its own differential rent scheme, so rules and rates will vary depending on the particular local authority. And a key part of this system is tenants must report any changes in income or their other household members. And this is crucially important in a system where rent is linked to ability to pay. So in summary, rent follows the household's means, not the market value or the cost of providing the home. So, in terms of how differential rent is usually worked out, so an important point here is there is no single national formula. Schemes apply a local calculation to assessable income, having regard to the household means policy. So step one is assessing the weekly income for household members. Step two is identifying the principal earner and applying the council's relevant percentage to their income. Step three is adding contributions from subsidiary earners, commonly subject to local rules or caps or percentages. And finally, any disregards, deductions, etc. are applied and the rent amount is then set. So, in summary, differential rents protect affordability while helping councils and AHBs to fund the management and maintenance of social housing stock. From an affordability perspective, falls in income mean lower rent liability, and the system requires regular income reviews and tenant engagement, as late updates can create backdated arrears and issues for households. The differential rent system is progressive in intent and effective in practice when local rules and clear and income data remains current. So next of all, we will go into a little more detail on the housing assistance payment. HAP is a major support route that meets long-term social housing need through the private rented sector. We're going to look at where HAP came from, how it works, what the payment model looks like, and how transfer options fit with social housing allocation. In terms of the policy origins of HAP, it was created to move long-term housing support from welfare-led rent supplement into a local authority social housing support. Rent supplement's origins are that it is a temporary social welfare allowance for the private rented sector. But by the 2000s, it had become a de facto social housing support with significant numbers of households reliant on it on a long-term basis. The introduction of HAP brought eligible households under the local authority social housing framework. The rules around rent supplement limited households' ability to engage in full-time employment. This is rectified under HAP, where increased employment means a higher differential rent amount rather than cessation of the support itself. In terms of its rollout, HAP was rolled out on a phased basis, launched in 3 local authorities in 2014, and national rollout was completed by 2017. The operating model is extremely efficient, with local authorities administering the HAP scheme, and the HAP Shared Service Centre in Limerick managing both landlord payments as well as rent collection. And for practitioners working in HAP, the legal basis for the scheme is Part 4 of the 2014 Housing Act, and people working in HAP should be very familiar with this piece of legislation. So, in terms of how HAP works, household is in a private tenancy with a private landlord, and the local authority administers the housing support and payment. So in terms of the steps in the process, the household is approved for social housing support. The household then independently sources a rental that meets its needs. There are, of course, property sourcing services available out there, including HAP Place Finder service, generally confined to people who are in a homeless situation or in an at-risk situation of homelessness. Once a household has sourced a rental, the tenant and the landlord submit a completed application to the local authority. And once the application is approved, the local authority pays the landlord and tenants make a differential rent payment to the local authority. If the rent on a property exceeds the relevant HAP limit and any discretion available to local authorities, any top-up payment is made by the tenant independently to the landlord. So an important area to cover when we're thinking about HAP is that HAP households can have a route to be considered for more traditional forms of social housing support through a separate transfer list option, subject to local rules. What's really important here is that households receiving HAP keep details current and visible to the local authority, including around income, medical needs, any disabilities, etc. Another important point is that HAP households being considered for allocation are not reassessed for social housing eligibility. This is because they are already receiving social housing support, and there is no mechanism within the system to reassess households that are in receipt of social housing. Crucially, HAP meets current need in the private rental sector, while the transfer list option keeps a route open to allocation of more traditional forms of social housing support that may be a desire of particular households. So, in terms of resources around HAP, there are numerous resources to support practitioners with implementation, and these are available on the Housing Manual. To reiterate, the legislation pertaining to HAP is Part 4 of the 2014 Housing Act and regulations made underneath that Act. And lastly, like in other areas, there is also a HAP Practitioners Forum. This is a national forum and a useful space for practitioners for clarifying local authority practice, sharing good ideas, and enhancing consistency of approach. So that brings me to the end of my part of the session. So I'll hand back over to Dimpna for Q&A.